Okay, this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing with our reading of Individuation, Volume 2, the history of the notion of the individual. I won't really go through in detail what we went through last week because we're going to start with Simondon's own summary of the last couple of sections. But we've been reading on the Epicureans, and then there was a section on Lucretius in particular. Simondon makes this contrast between the Epicureans and the Stoic in connection with their physics and their conception of the individual, where the Epicureans treat the real individual as the atoms, which are smaller than the human individual, and then the Stoics, on the other hand, treat the true individual as being the universe as a whole, which is greater than the human individual. So there's a difference between seeing the human individual as a composite out of multiple sort of fundamental individuals in the Epicurean physics, and then seeing the human individual as being a component of the true individual, which is the universe in the Stoic physics. And there's also a distinction between the mechanical causality that we find in Epicurean physics and the finalism of the Stoic physics. So we'll see more of that when we get to the summary part for today. And then the rest of today we'll go through sort of the late Hellenistic era. So some of the later philosophers. So this is like first to third century AD, more or less. And I think we'll probably end up just at the beginning of the Christianity section. So it's a little bit out of temporal order because he treats some like third century AD philosophers before he goes back to look at Christianity and the origins of Christianity and so on. Okay, so I'll start reading. So we're starting from page 501 of the PDF, the section heading Summary. Okay, summary. We are therefore asserting that when it comes to individual reality, philosophical doctrines have an attitude that constitutes a theory of nature in the old sense of the term. Ionian physiology represents one of the two general aspects of the doctrine of nature, the force that makes things grow, that pushes them to be and individualizes them, insofar as individualization results from the production of beings, either because we start with a continuum like the apeiron, or because we start with an infinite void populated by an infinity of atomic corpuscles, which amounts to the same productivity, the element function then being represented by the ensemble of the void and matter. The other aspect of the theory of nature is that of the fact of the already fully constituted universe that possesses a unity of organization in its totality, but not a power of productivity in each of its parts. This second path is that of rationalism. Insofar as the universe is taken as a constituted whole, the only path of intelligibility that remains is that of the comprehension of finality, whether apparent or hidden, and of the unique order that must be discovered. The universe is nothing but nature in its totality. It consists of parts, but is not constituted by its elements. In this case, a superior intelligence and a mobile will, which is distinct from the elements even when it suffuses them, are necessary to account for this unity and anteriority of the whole with respect to the parts. In the second case, nature is a realized creative intention, a plan, and therefore a finality is revealed in it. This path is that of a rationalism because reason grasps the ensemble insofar as it corresponds to a unique intention. Conversely, the first conception does not seek to justify everything, to valorize everything based on its rapport to the ensemble. The intellectual operation is required to understand the genesis of beings, but not to operate their integration into the overarching plan. These two opposed conceptions do not envision individual reality in the same way. For the first conception, the individual is what is at the end of a genesis and does not become integrated into a whole, except through this genesis. Its relation to nature is one of immediate contact. On the contrary, in the doctrine that conceives nature as a finalized whole, there is no isolated genesis of the individual being. This individual being is merely a part of the plan, a member of the organism. It is not itself nature. It is in nature, must participate in nature, but is not nature. This consolidation of the individual being, which depends on the order of things by becoming initiated into the plan of the universe, can only take place by way of a detachment of what is immediate in sensation and in the existence of the instant. Being detaches from the immediate on behalf of vaster mediations that attach it back to the order of the universe. Conversely, with the Ionian and Epicurean path, the individual being seeks to detach from all subordinating mediations to create an immediate contact with respect to what surrounds it. in particular to what is not individualized and harbors more creative force. The elements, water, earth, air, fire, indeed contain this power of physis in the primordial and original state. They are the source of this eternal emergence of forms. The individual being is not the only form of being that can exist. It is not first and it is not last. It has no more dignity and perfection than the non-individual being, like the element. The individualized being remains parallel with this non-individualized being in the world. The individual is merely one aspect of being, and the relation of the individual being to nature in this is this contact between non-individualized elements. The earth gives birth to man. The plant rises and takes root on the sacred shores of the day. The only true mediation for the individual is the relation to the species, because it is the species that populates the water, the earth, or the air. Grandiferasque domos audium camposque virantes, the leafy haunts of birds and verdant plains, is the expression Lucretius uses to designate the forest, which is for him a veritable element, and the plains, which are also an element, both of which originate from this fundamental element of the earth. Later on, speaking of an old and happy sage, when Virgil says, Daptibus mensas onerabat inemptis, it loaded his table with unbought supplies, or when he describes the customs of bees, he is no longer acting just for Augustus. Something much stronger and more concrete than an official poetry animates his thought. Immediate contact with the natural elements, or with things not produced by human society, not mediated by commerce and exchange. This individual wisdom of the bond with things is also found in Rousseau and in quite a few individualists. Nevertheless, the literary and doctrinal expression of this attitude is rare because the literary expression is in general the search for a mediation. It is therefore almost inevitable that we find more authors who have sought to express the meaning of their life according to the finality of the universe than authors who wanted to proclaim their relation to natural beings. This immediate relation does not seek to be mediated in a city of letters. The Stoic intention, on the contrary, aims toward expression and to a certain extent constitutes a philosophy of expression. Since expression is a gesture and a role to play, the persona coincides with the reality that the individual being discovers as destiny in a human cosmos. It is in this sense that we can bring Platonic thought closer to the Ionians, for it seeks to define beings genetically, whether it be a question of the cosmic work of the demiurge or the formation of elements based on primordial triangles within the Cora. Aristotelianism, on the other hand, is more like Stoicism, in the sense that it leads to a vision that integrates beings into a universe that tends towards the unmoved mover and form without matter. The distinction between the doctrines that consider the individual as a temporal series and those that consider it as a bundle of rapports in the order of simultaneity is insufficient. Within each of these groups of doctrines, we must still distinguish between the conception that defines the individual for itself and one that first integrates it into a vaster order by defining it by its function within this order, while the other doctrine defines it by its structure. Right, so here he's introducing a second principle of classification of doctrines of the individual. So we saw earlier, a few weeks ago, we saw this distinction between the order of simultaneity and the order of succession, or order of being and order of becoming, which he uses to distinguish between Plato and Aristotle in terms of their doctrines of the individual. And then now he's introducing this second principle of classification, so that we have to, within each of those groups, we have to divide the doctrine that treats the individual for itself, or that defines the individual in its own terms, and then another set of doctrines that understands the individual with reference to an order that's greater than the individual, that integrates the individual into some sort of more complex or more a wider order. And so this is the distinction between the Epicurean and the Stoic doctrine that I mentioned at the beginning of today's meeting. Right, and so this distinction between these two orders, two accounts of the individual, also coincides with a sort of difference in terms of their approach to mediation. So the Stoics understand they want to have this sort of mediation between the individual and the cosmic order, and we saw in the Stoic physics there's this doctrine of resonance, and the idea that the individual should resonate in harmony with the frequency of the universe. There's a certain ratio of the resonance of the individual and the universe, and those should be in harmony with each other. Whereas in the Epicurean doctrine, there's instead this appreciation for an immediate uh, apprehension of the natural world. So this immediate contact through sensation with the elements that make up the world. This is sort of what's valorized in Epicurean physics as opposed to the mediation with the harmony of the universe. And so these doctrines that start from the individual treat the immediate as the goal of thought, this immediate apprehension of the elements that make up the world, and then the doctrine that integrates the individual into a larger order treats mediation and connection with that larger order as being the goal of thought. And there's also this interesting sort of explanation of why we tend to find more people or more authors who are interested in this mediation than we do this authors who are interested in this immediate apprehension of the world. So writing, of course, is a kind of mediation. Writing a book and publishing it, and trying to receive commentary from others and appreciation from others, and so on. This is a kind of mediation. So there's a certain connection between treating mediation as the goal of thought and writing and publishing your thoughts. Whereas on the other hand, if you treat the goal of thought to be this immediate contact with the elements of the world, then you are less likely to have any interest in writing and publishing those thoughts, and so we end up having this sort of disproportion between the number of authors who are on this mediation side and the number of authors who are on the immediate side, just by virtue of the fact that writing is itself a kind of mediation.
One thing that I thought was interesting at the beginning of this section, and I don't know if I just didn't pick up on this point that he was making before, but he talks about immune physiology, and he says that there is a force that makes things grow that pushes them to be and individualizes them, so far as individualization results from the production of beings. And I guess it seems like what he's saying there is that the individuation is the individuation of the elements, and then Usus is the, I guess, internal sort of principle of generation of the elements, but it only results in individualization as opposed to further individuation. There seems to be something in here about the difference between, like, there's more room, or there is room, I guess, period, for contingency and motion and individualization that there isn't in the, like, kind of total initial individuation, Stoic rationalism.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I'm not sure that Simondon here is using, like, he uses the term individualization, but I'm not sure that he's using it in the sort of technical sense that he introduced in Volume One, where he contrasts individuation and individualization. Yeah, so I think I think he may be using it here as a sort of synonym for individuation, just sort of treating the two terms interchangeably, rather than using it in the specific technical sense. But you're right that in the Epicurean physics, there's room for freedom and contingency in a way that there isn't in the Stoic physics. So we have this clinamen, the swerve of the atoms, and this is sort of treated as equivalent to human freedom, the capacity that we have to choose different options in a various situation. Whereas for the Stoics, the universe operates according to providence, and individuals are subject to a destiny that they have to realize, and so I think, I don't think it's an accident that we find this contingency on the side of the doctrine that treats the individual for itself, as opposed to the determinism that we find on the side of the doctrine that treats the individual as incorporated into something greater, because that incorporation into something greater is a kind of subordination of the individual to the order of that greater whole. And so the to the extent that there's contingency in the individual and this capacity for self production or self determination or something along those lines, to that extent, that individual is not incorporated into the greater order of the world. So, yeah, it makes sense that we would find contingency to be associated with a stronger notion of the individual as opposed to the determinism and the notion of the order of the whole.
Yeah, it also seems like maybe there's a kind of distrust of sensation in philosophy of the individual that privileges simultaneity. I remember reading that in like Eleatic philosophy, the like apparent motion is really just an illusion, which would be, I guess, the impression from immediate sensations that motion actually happens in the world. And then also in the Stoic philosophy, he's suggesting here that there's a detachment, that the rationalism of Stoicism proceeds by way of a detachment of what is immediate in sensation. I guess I don't really know what the like essential connection there is. And then I thought that the point about the mediation of the species was kind of surprising at first, because he's stressed the kind of hostility to mediation in Epicurean mode. But maybe the point there is that the species is kind of, I guess, individuated or individualized straight out of the element as well, which is why he has these quotes about the birds and the species populating the water, earth, or air, which are the elements, like therefore the individual.
Yeah, there's a sort of relative notion of elements here. So, of course, the fundamental elements are, or the most fundamental level in the Epicurean physics, we just have atoms and the void, which sort of play this role of elements because they are the generative principles out of which everything else is created. And then at maybe like another level of abstraction, or one level above the atoms in the void, we have the four elements: the fire, water, earth, and air. Um, these sort of traditional notions of the four elements. And so each of these elements, again, has this role of a generative principle, and producing the entities that correspond to the specific nature of each of those elements. And then he also, Simondon here, suggests, kind of in passing, he doesn't really go into this point, but he suggests that like the forest or the plain are elements for Lucretius, in the sense, again, that they have this generative capacity, that they produce the entities, the trees and the birds and whatever lives in the forest. All of these entities are generated by this sort of elementary principle that is the forest, as opposed to being sort of artificially put together in some sense, or being just sort of contingent collections of entities. They have this generative capacity. The forest has this generative capacity that all the creatures that belong to the forest share. And so we can think of this elementhood as being sort of a notion that proceeds through these layers of abstraction, that each layer, at every level, we have something like an element for the levels above, so that water can be an element for, say, the fish that live in the water. And then at another level below that, we would treat the atoms in the void as the elements that make up the water. And so, yeah, we can understand this notion of elementhood in sort of relative terms.
And I just had one more thing I wanted to say on this section is this. I don't, I mean, I know he's being like extremely general, but I don't, like, based on the parts of the physics that I've read so far, I don't know if it's fair to say that Aristotle moves towards a notion of form without matter. So that, the materials, like, you may be emphasizing form as against somebody like Anaxagoras, Anaxagoras, who says that the material is primary because if you bury the bed, then the tree sprouts up and not another bed. But it doesn't seem like he's throwing away the notion of the importance of the material. But I know that the places acknowledges that it's both the Aristotelian conception.
Yeah. Let me just see if I can find that Yeah. So I think let me just find what the translation says here. I was looking at the French. Yeah. So it's not the Aristotelian doctrine that tends towards form without matter. It's the universe within the Aristotelian doctrine that has this tendency towards the unmoved mover, which itself is a form without matter. The unmoved mover or God is a thought thinking itself that is pure form without matter. And so
Okay.
yeah, so that's what that sentence is referring to. Uh, yeah, so this doctrine of the unmoved mover and of God as thought thinking itself appears in the metaphysics book Lambda, and there's also some passages in the De Anima that are often connected with it on the agent intellect. I think we talked about this when we were reading the Aristotle section, but the precise connection between the passages in the Metaphysics Lambda and the passages in the De Anima is pretty obscure because these are just sort of like Aristotle doesn't go through sort of a systematic doctrine of what the unmoved mover is. He just sort of gives these enigmatic phrases about thought thinking itself and the pure form without matter. But yeah, that's what this passage is referring to here.
Thank you. That makes a lot more sense.
Okay, so let's go on to the next passage. We have a couple of short sections, so maybe we can read like probably 3 or 4 of those short ones. If you'd like to go on to the next ones.
Yeah. Should I just read through the end of the Carneades section? So the other ones are pretty short.
Yeah, sure, that works.
Okay. Cynic hedonism. Cynic hedonism extends Epicureanism, but attempts to give it a broader basis by connecting it back to certain preoccupations of the Stoics. What results is a sort of slightly simple eclecticism, but it is endowed with an immense power of vulgarization. Literary genre that corresponds to this doctrine is the diatribe. Aniceris gives an absolute value to everything that connects the individual to other men, friendships, bonds of the family, and of the fatherland. Nevertheless, this attachment of the individual must occur in a way that is real and not deceptive and artificial. One must not be attached to opinion, but instead to the reality of beings. According to Bion of Borysthenes, fortune has allotted men their fates in a way that is overbearing and incomprehensible for them, without any providence. Happiness consists in being satisfied with one's fate, autarkeia, and applying oneself to every circumstance, just like a navigator obeys the winds. Pyrrho. Pyrrho wants to obtain the state of silence and ataraxia for the individual. He obtains it by declaring that things are equal and without difference, unstable and indiscernible, and that consequently our sensations and opinions are neither true nor false. No thing is rather than is not, and each thing is and is not. Each thing is and is not. Each thing neither is or is not. The suspension of judgment, epoche, endeavors to stabilize the individual. Men shouldn't justify Homer's verse that compares them to the leaves of a tree. Haughty solitude and disdain are better than useless agitation. Quote, a nature of the divine and the good exists eternally, from whence the most equitable life for man derives. Unquote. These are the words that Pyrrho lends to Timon at the beginning of his poem Images, Indal Moy. This ideal comes close to that of the Hindu gymnosophists, of whom Pyrrho was aware due to his travels with Alexander the Great. Aristo of Chios. This same indifference that stabilizes the individual is encountered in Aristo. For him, the highest good is adiaphoria, or absence of attachment to things. Furthermore, the individual must be capable of judging morally without the need for a paraenesis that specifies all particular cases, the number of which would consequently always be too restricted. What is refused is the theory of preferables, and with it the whole of paraenesis that attaches man back to his milieus. The individual, in fact, possesses a power of absolute initiative that makes it possible to decide and even to act even faced with indifferent things. This is epiloustican kinesin, a phrase inherited from one of Chrysippus's texts. Carneades. Carneades extends Plato's thought by way of a theory that critiques the Stoics' thought, particularly the notion of comprehensive representation. Carneades critiques the comprehensive nature of representation as the recognition of an individuality of the grasped object. What gives knowledge its security is not the grasping of this absolute individuality of the object, The subject himself, through the comparison he establishes between perceptions and the critique to which he submits his different sensations. The subject with his own activity is someone who can choose between the objects with which existence must be harmonized and those that appear to him deceptively. There is no absolute presence of the individuality of the object that guarantees its existence for us. We can confuse two twins, and we do not know how to distinguish between two eggs presented to us. If the criterion of the absolute individuality of objects were valid, there would be no indiscernibles. Yet there are indiscernibles. Thus, we see that according to Carneades, the world surrounding the human subject does not consist of beings as rigorously individualized as Stoics would like, and this individuality of objects cannot be turned into a certain principle of knowledge, since we can be deceived about the identity of two very similar individuals, like twins. Knowledge, which is only affected by certain degrees of probability, is always approximate, but is never perfectly adequate to its object, is not a grasping of individual reality. The veritable individual is the object, but this individual is not inserted by knowledge into a world within which everything would already be arranged and determined, as the Stoics would like. There is around the human individual a certain margin of uncertainty, of indetermination that leaves him with freedom both in knowledge and action. This freedom depends on the breadth of the criterion of the probable, which contrasts with the all or nothing criterion of the truth of knowledge and the goodness of actions in the Stoics. The critical examination of representations is substituted for a supposedly direct grasping of objects. Quote, a representation is never solitary, but representations are suspended by one another like links in a chain, unquote. Correlatively, Stoic theology is thrust back into an impenetrable mystery. Indeed, according to Carneades, it is impossible to affirm contradictory attributes for the same being. However, if the God of the Stoics is acknowledged, one will be obligated to say that he is endowed with a voice and deprived of a voice, endowed with generation and deprived of generation, and will have to successively avow and disavow all the attributes of God. This is due to the fact that the Stoics wanted to turn God not only into an individualized being, but into the principle of the individual unity of the cosmos. This argumentation is reminiscent of what Kant develops against metaphysical dogmatism by revealing the contradictions and aporias to which this dogmatism leads. Uh, what what Carneades critiques in the Stoics is, in fact, this unity of the world conceived as an organized individual. From the fact that nothing happens without a cause, it cannot be concluded that all things are linked together in such a way as to form a system that weaves each event into a unique weft of emarmene, which makes all events of the world into externally different yet deeply interconnected aspects of universal determinism, the determinism which is, moreover, always suffused with finality. What Carneades refuses is the unity of a nature that would be a given fact once and for all, fixed for all eternity by destiny. Free will of the individual is indeed real. It is not an illusion that would have to be converted into an acceptance of the order of the universe, recognized as sacred and holy. There can be independent causes that are inserted from outside into the weft of things, and the free will of man is one of these causes. In this doctrine, individuality is no longer constituted by a quality proper, as in the Stoics, but by the source of an activity of critique and decision, a power of choice. The individuality of the subject detaches from the individuality of the object and stands out in a relief that it will retain throughout the various traditions of philosophical thought. The doctrine of Carneades prepares Descartes' reflection as well as the critique that Kant addresses to Descartes for having asserted a substantiality of the subject of knowledge. I thought that this section in Carneades was particularly interesting. It seems like for Carneades, there's a kind of like epistemological inexactness, or like a impossibility of like a perfect individuation of objects of knowledge that is not paralleled by the objects themselves. I think he says that there's something about an absolute individuality of the objects, but the objects themselves. But as objects of knowledge, they're only ever probable. And as he notes at the end of this section about this separation between subject and object, in the like little Aristotle that I've read so far, in the notion of form as like an aspect that is disclosed by the way that we talk about things, there doesn't seem to be that kind of a kind of fundamental separation between like the object itself and the way in which the object is intelligible. I guess, yeah, it's interesting, this suggestion that this is when that divide really opens up.
Yeah, in Aristotle's theory of knowledge, we have the form of the object sort of appears in our mind at the same time. So it's the same form, hoarseness or socratiety or whatever form we're uh, contemplating. It's the numerically the same form that is in our mind and that is in the object. So there's no notion of sort of representation or um, some sort of distinction between the mind, the object of knowledge, and the objects in itself. Whereas here, I mean, I only know Carneades secondhand, so I'm not too confident in this interpretation aspect. But here we have this doctrine of probability that the only kind of knowledge we can have is probable knowledge, so that uh, true knowledge of an individual would be one that allows us to distinguish that individual from any other entity. It would absolutely individuate that individual, whereas we have only a limited capacity to distinguish individuals. So he points out, like twins, for example, we might confuse one for the other, even though they're numerically distinct objects. They share enough properties that it becomes hard or even impossible to distinguish one from the other. Um, and so this is something we can also connect with Leibniz's notion of the identity of indiscernibles. So Leibniz states this principle that if any two objects share all of their properties, then those two objects are actually just the same object. There's actually no we can't make sense of the notion of two objects that share all of their properties but are still numerically distinct. Even if so, the distinction might just be spatial location. For example, you might have one egg that is intrinsically identical to a second egg, but they're in two separate locations, so they have at least one property that is different from each other. And You can actually, interestingly, in second order logic, you can actually define equality just as the uh, identity of properties. So, like for all properties, if an object X has all the same properties as an object Y, then X is equal to Y. You can define identity in terms of sharing properties. So this for Carneades, there's this sort of gap between the idea of true knowledge, this sort of ideal of knowledge, and our merely probable grasp on entities. We can only have this knowledge or approximate knowledge of entities through probability, and we can't individuate entities. So the principle of identity of indiscernibles doesn't hold for objects of knowledge. And this sort of separates off a sphere of the sort of the realm of probability or the realm of appearances in a way that we don't really find we don't find it in quite the same way in previous authors. We have this realm of the merely probable, or the realm of appearances of entities that forms a sort of distinct stratum from the realm of reality as it is itself, that we don't have access to. Another bit, going back to the short section on Pyrrho, it's interesting here that that Simondon here mentions the Indian gymnosophists. They like it's not 100% known, I think, like who exactly these gymnosophists were. Like this is the Greek name for these Indian sages of some kind. But So it's not clear what school exactly these gymnosophists would have belonged to, but there are some interesting connections between this the Pyrrhonian doctrine, this Pyrrhonian skepticism, and certain Indian philosophies that have to do with treating the world as a realm of illusion. The sensible world and the world that we know is a world of illusion, and there's a sort of unity of the world, or unity with the divine, which is the reality behind the world. And the sage has to cultivate a kind of indifference to the world, and through this indifference to the world can achieve a kind of unity with the divine. But whereas on the other hand, we find in Pyrrho, in the Pyrrhonian skepticism, we have it's not so much this notion of a unity with the divine. It's the indifference itself is cultivated as an end in itself. So it's the idea is to avoid disturbance that comes from being attached to opinions about things. So your we have this sort of natural tendency to form opinions that something is X or it is not Y or whatever. And by becoming attached to these opinions, we sort of lose our tranquility. We have an emotional investment in X being Y, or X not being Y, as the case may be. And then we also have this sort of instability, because something that seems to be like, at one moment we might think, we might have the opinion that X is Y, but then later on we might have the contrary opinion when the appearances change, or when the circumstances seem to reinforce the contrary position. And so we switch from one opinion to the next. And the idea of ataraxia is to overcome this instability, and by suspending our judgments, and not actually allowing ourselves to become attached to opinions, we sort of preserve stability instead of having this instability of opinions. And so there's this notion of philosophy not just as an intellectual doctrine where we try to recognize, true statements about the world, but philosophy as a kind of spiritual discipline where we cultivate this state of ataraxia to preserve the stability of our minds in the face of a world that sort of naturally leads us to opinions. And I think this notion of philosophy as a spiritual discipline or spiritual exercise of some kind is something that's common to most of ancient Greek philosophy, but especially as we'll see as we continue with today's reading, in the later Hellenistic period, and there's a sort of blending of philosophy and religion or magic, and there's a continuity between the sort of intellectual discipline of philosophy and a sort of religious or practical sphere of activity in magic or religion or similar practices. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. I can read this one. Let's see how long it is. I think I'll read two sections because they're both short-ish. Okay, Panetius. Plato's thought is accommodated quite enthusiastically in Panetius. The individuality of the Stoic cosmos is critiqued severely. Panetius does not want to accept influence at a distance, which is the agent of this unity. What appearance, from an almost infinite distance, can the influence of the stars extend as far as the moon, or rather the earth? The Stoics' universal sympathy, founded on the notion of resonance, which implies action at a distance, is refused here in the name of a rational evidence intended to destroy this incoercible unity of the cosmos. Panetius also rejects divination founded on universal sympathy. He asserts a certain slack in destiny. Human reason is the development of civilization. Human reason in the development of civilization is more interesting to Panetius than divine reason immanent to the cosmos. The human soul has no destiny outside the body. The soul does not exist before birth because the moral resemblance of children relative to their parents reveals affiliation of the soul and not just of the body. The soul must die because it is born. It is corruptible because it is subject to illness. It decomposes at death, and its ethereal part goes back to the heights of the world from whence it came. Human individuality is therefore a reality in becoming, fully submitted to generation and corruption. Our individual nature is what must be taken as a rule. quote, "For we must so act as not to oppose the universal laws of human nature, but, while safeguarding those, to follow the bent of our own particular nature. And even if other careers should be better and nobler, we must still regulate our own posits by the standard of our own nature," unquote. These words are taken from On Duty, the treatise proffered by Cicero as inspired by Panetius' treatise On Duty. To live in conformity with nature is to live according to the inclinations it has given us. An individual nature therefore exists according to Panetius. There is also a human nature. It can be summarily defined by ratio et oratio, reason and language, of which the beasts are ignorant. This nature is like an individuality of the species that distinguishes it from other species in this way. This human nature provides norms for action. It is quite contrary to humanity to meditate at feasts to which one is invited, or to sing in the public square. Relation is part of human nature as a social bond. It is what defines the justice between enemies, in the same way that oaths are made to be respected. Nature is what invites us to restraint and this self-respect that verecundia, modesty, constitutes. Human virtues are natural tendencies regulated by reason. There are tendencies in beasts that correspond to all the virtues, a desire to see and to understand, and a disinterested tendency for play corresponding to the speculative virtue, a desire for self-preservation corresponding to courage and temperance, innate social tendencies. With Panetius, nature becomes immanent to individuals and to species, to every living thing. It is not reserved for the universe in its indecomposable organic totality. Nature becomes a certain internal finality and reciprocal conformity of the elements of activity in their mutual rapports. In this sense, according to Cicero, who was inspired by Panetius, it will be inhumane to use eloquence to the detriment of good men when the natural role of eloquence is to protect them. Postodonious. The same transformation is found in Postodonious. The rational character of the universe still exists, but it is force that is rational, not reason, which is a force. The divine fire is no longer a reason initially, it is an organic force, the vis vitalis of Seneca, or the zotique dynamis of Postodonius. There is no longer merely a nature, but natures. The world is a system formed by, quote, "the sky, the earth, and the natures within them," unquote. Postodonius' physics is a dynamism that insists on the expansion of life and the gradual complication of living beings. The unity of the world is no longer that of a single organized body. It is deployed in an immense variety of hierarchically ordered beings. Zeus, nature, and destiny are three hierarchically ordered terms. Zeus is force in its unity. Destiny is the same force contemplated from multiple aspects, and nature is the power emanated from Zeus to bind the multiple forces of destiny. This triad still appears in Cicero's On Divinity, which is inspired by 5 books that Postodonius wrote on the same subject. Nature contains the principle of all events. The manner of envisioning individual reality therefore changes throughout the dynamistic doctrines. The individual is not the whole being. There remains some non-individualized being. Furthermore, and consequently, there is a nature in the individual because there is not a single nature that would be the world, and an apportionment of nature makes it possible to give a greater consistency to individual. The individual can have direct relations with God through mystical enthusiasm. Duration has a lot of importance in the individual soul. Opinions and passions do not depend on facts alone. Passion is not the same in the various individuals who share the same opinions. However, habit or vice cause the strongest passions for the same opinion about good and evil. The veritable cause of the passions is due to the fact that there are 2 parts in us, a daimon which is of the same nature as God, and a bad, bestial, irrational, atheistic part. Passion consists in submitting the second part to the first. Reason has no capacity to combat or assuage the passion. This irrational and unsystematic dynamism can only be transformed by means that are homogeneous with respect to it. For example, certain musical rhythms reduce anger or desire. The human individual is the being who is capable of a multitude of actions and who synthesizes seemingly contradictory activities. Diogenes and Daedalus can be admired at the same time. Arts and techniques are part of human civilization. Man is capable of plurality. Man and nature in the most complex manifestations of their activity must be embraced in a single perspective. Human reason pertaining to the individual being is indivisible. It must be artisanal and theoretical to an equal degree. Anacharsis invented the potter's wheel. Democritus invented the kiln. These are sages who invented arts that facilitate everyday life, like that of construction. They discovered metals and their uses, the agricultural arts, the grain mill. Art and nature are not opposites. The same man who witnessed a forest fire liquefy metal invented metallurgy. The grindstone of the mill operates like human teeth. Endowed with this observational capacity and inventive dynamism, the individual establishes continuity between art and nature. The object of philosophy is to rediscover a dynamic continuity everywhere. Roman civilization is a continuation of the preceding Etruscan and Greek civilization. Right. These 2 figures seem to be, I think, less interesting than some of the earlier ones. They're probably interesting more from a historical perspective because of the way that Cicero draws on them. And so the sort of influence that they have is more relevant than like their intrinsic interests of their doctrines. But again, we have so in Panetius we have this kind of even though there's a rejection of certain Stoic doctrines, there's a similar understanding of how the individual should be content with their place in the order of the world. There's a sort of nature assigns to the individual certain inclinations, and these inclinations lead us to a particular vocation. And so, even if one field of activity is considered more noble than the one that we have found ourselves in, we shouldn't aspire to change the field of activity that we're in. So if you happen to be born as a peasant, that's part of your nature or what the nature has assigned to you, and you shouldn't desire to be I don't know, a statesman or whatever. You should just be content with the position that you find yourself in. And then in Postodonious we have yeah, it's not quite as clear what Postodonius has to say about the relation of the individual to the universal order, but there's this notion of the individual as having sort of contrary capacities. So the individual can be the individual can have capacities for creation of technical objects and invention and so on as part of their capacities, and we can admire that capacity at the same time as we admire someone like Diogenes, who withdraws from the world and lives this sort of separate lifestyle. So we can treat both of those things as having some desirability at the same time, even if they're incompatible. So here, I think, is an interesting one thing that's interesting here is that there's maybe for the first time this notion of a plurality of values appears, whereas earlier philosophers tend to have one idea of what the good life consists in. For Aristotle, it's contemplation and so on. There's one sort of ideal of what the good life consists in, and everyone should live in accordance with that ideal. Here we have this seeming plurality of values where Diogenes and Daedalus are both admirable at the same time, even though their activity is incompatible, or their activities are incompatible with each other. So this is maybe a more subtle and more complex idea of what the good life might consist in.
Yeah, I thought the section on Posidonius was interesting too, because of what you were just talking about. This it seems like there's a possibility for this kind of ambivalence because of this, so almost like the dualism of the divine part of us and the rational and bestial part of us that allows us to like two contradictory things at the same time.
Yeah, I again only know Postodonius secondhand, so I'm not too sure about the interpretation. But yeah, I think the idea here is that our admiration for Diogenes and Daedalus at the same time is supposed to be one that is sort of within the rational side of the individual, as opposed to having to do with this opposition between the rational and the bestial. So I think it's as rational beings, we can admire incompatible modes of existence or incompatible courses of action. So I think it's within the rational side of this division that we have this incompatibility maintained. And if that's correct, that's an interesting sort of complication of the notion of rationality. It's not something that's sort of simple and immediately obvious. It has this sort of obscurity within it of incompatible goals being valued at the same time.
Yeah, that's even more interesting than if it was on the basis of the two different natures. I wanted to ask the first sentence in the Postodonious section. I don't know if it's just awkward wording or maybe the translation, but is the idea that in Postodonious there is a force? I mean, is what he's the distinction between Postodonious and the physics is that the force is not reason itself. I'm not. I just don't really. I don't really get that distinction between a force that is rational, not reason, which is a force.
Right. Yeah, I think this is a translation issue. So we have, yeah, there it says not reason, comma, which is a force. I think that comma should be deleted. So it should read, it is not force that is rational. Or sorry, it is force that is rational, not reason, which is a force. So the idea is that whereas the Stoics have this doctrine of reason acting as a force to govern the world. Instead, we have this notion of a force, the natural force of entities that is rational itself. So there's, I guess, a difference of emphasis whether you start from the side of reason and then consider it to be active in the world and have force and efficacy, or you start from the side of the forces, these natural forces, and consider them to be rational. And I think that's the opposition that Simondon is making here.
Okay, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. And then I thought this notion that in Posidonius there is where he says the individual is not the whole being, there remains some non-individualized being. Sounds like in a way he gets close to the notion of I guess, a pre-individual share. But it wasn't clear to me in what sense the individual has a non-individualized or there is a non-individualized being after individuation or individualization. And maybe it's this because there are these three ordered beings, which seem to be sort of different ways of looking at the same thing almost. Like if you look at something as an individual, in light of the Zeus as a being, you leave out certain aspects of that individual, seen under the rubric or the notion of nature as a being or destiny. But if that's not it, I'm not sure what the pre-individualized being is here.
Yeah, let me just find that passage again. Hmm, right. Yeah, I guess the idea here is that we have this hierarchical sort of descent from Zeus to nature to destiny, but each term in that hierarchy is doesn't exhaust the terms that precede it. So Zeus is something more than nature, and nature is something more than destiny. We so in it's only at the level of destiny that we have something like an individual individualization, I guess. And there's at the level of nature and of Zeus, we're dealing with something that is not individualized, and this is something that precedes the individual and is more fundamental or of higher order than the individual. I think it's something along those lines that he has in mind here.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Right. Okay. So let's go on to Epictetus, the next section, if you'd like to read.
Yeah, I can. Maybe I'll read through Plutarch because the Plotinus section is pretty long.
Right. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Epictetus. Epictetus discovers in philosophical activity a necessary condition for the individual's possession of all human rights. Quote, philosophical dogma is what keeps one's head up for those who are downtrodden, unquote. Due to this activity, the slave and the freeman can look tyrants and the wealthy right in the eye. Indeed, in the age of Epictetus, the condition of the naive person is increasingly rare, and Epictetus himself is a freed slave. Manual labor is not dishonorable. What is honorable is man's activity, not his birth. Here, the distinction between ta o femen comes to the fore again. But what does not depend on me are my ancestors, my relatives, my friends, my reputation, my temporary stay. Unquote. On the other hand, the individual absolutely possesses the use of his representations. This is where his freedom resides. No one can force him to think what he does not think. In this sense, man can turn away from what is a state, a fact, does not pertain to the individual, in order to go toward what is an act. And proceeding from the individual belongs to him. Representation is a condition of the act, is therefore a condition of freedom. Moreover, it is an act in itself. Instead of being preoccupied with the means that allow him to integrate into the world, the individual being, on the contrary, seeks to know how he will always be independent from a situation of fact. He discovers this condition in his own activity. Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius instead seeks to reconnect the individual to the universe. He conceives death as a diffusion into the whole and an emancipation. Death allows us to avoid the perils that lie in wait for the individual and his integrity, particularly that of intellectual decline. This reconnection to the universe is what gives a meaning to individual life, which is so fleeting and unstable. The moral act is like a flowering of universal nature within man. Man must produce moral acts like a tree bears its fruit without knowing it. Marcus Aurelius declares there are two fatherlands, Rome insofar as he is himself, and the world insofar as he is man. The sole good is what is useful for these two fatherlands. The individual is a being who must insert himself into the world by way of his activity. Such a mediation leads to a valorization of effort, of labor. Laboremus ceterum nihil expedit. Let us work, or else there is no use to anything. Plutarch. A rebirth of Platonism becomes apparent in Plutarch, who does not define man in the midst of the human world as the center of all preoccupations, but with respect to a nature and a world that does not grant preeminence to man. There is no humanism in Plutarch. The reasonable man is in certain respects inferior to the plants and animals. Quote, do not be surprised if animals without reason follow nature better than rational beings. From this point of view, animals are even inferior to plants, to which nature has given no representation or penchant capable of deviating from nature. Quote. This idea of a departure from anthropocentrism, is that a reference back to when he started talking about the Hellenistic era, and he gave that sociological account of political instability and focus on the individual in light of that. Was that the beginning of the anthropocentric era that he's referring to here?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, there's this idea in Plutarch of man or the human being as capable of deviating from nature because of reason in a way that other natural beings are not capable of, and plants are even superior to animals in the fact that they can't deviate from the natural order. And I think that this is a sort of inversion of the order of the way that previous philosophers had treated the human individual, the rational being, as superior to animals and plants are probably not even considered, but superior to animals in being able to grasp the order of the world or to understand the order of the world and so on. There were a couple of translation points that I wanted to mention. So in the epictetus section, let's see, it's about the naive person. Yeah, that is that's a literal translation of the French. But Simondon was using the word ingénieux as the equivalent of the Latin term ingenuus, which means a freeborn person. So what he's saying here is that in the era of Epictetus, there are the proportion of the Roman society that is freeborn is diminishing, and so you have a sort of polarization of society into the slaves and the freed slaves on the one hand, and the slave owners on the other. So there's this status of being freeborn is increasingly rare in that period. So that's one translation point. And then in the Marcus Aurelius passage, there's the quote from Marcus Aurelius in Latin. He says, "Laboremus ceterum nihil expedit." It's not let us work or else there is no use to anything. It's let us work or else nothing will help us, or nothing will be useful to us, something along those lines. So the idea is that there's this, as Simoneau puts it here, there's this valorization of labor, or of work. So we have to work at our moral betterment, and this is something that like moral betterment has this effort built into it. The effort to be better is itself worthy of praise, and this is something we saw with previous Stoics. Even though Marcus Aurelius is a Stoic, with previous Stoics there was this sort of disdain for effort, where the sage has to sort of have this immediate sort of flash in which they come to harmonize with the universe and resonate in harmony with the frequency of the universe. This sort of immediate moment of grace, and there's no sense in which effort or striving to be good or something like that is actually morally praiseworthy. You either succeed at resonating with the universe or you don't, and that's it's a either or. Here in Marcus Aurelius, we have a valorization of the effort, of moral effort, as such, as something that is valuable.
That the notion of representation as a condition for the act, with representation itself being an action, was interesting in the epictetus section. I guess the idea is that with regard to representation as an act, there's always a prior representation that generates it as an act, because otherwise it would seem like there might be a problem with there needing to be if representation of what generates action and is itself action, has to be, I guess, the point at which that starts.
Yeah, there's a question of like you can think what you want, or like if you think of if we understand action as being produced by representation or thought or mental activity of some kind, and then at the same time we treat mental activity as itself an action, then we would have to sort of insert another volition that would be responsible for the mental action. And if that volition in turn is an action, then we need a further volition and so on. So we need like an infinite series of mental actions just to start one physical action. Yeah, so I think the idea here is a sort of self-containedness of the world of representation, or the domain of representation, so that we have freedom to think what we want, and no one can actually force us to think anything. So you can be a slave, and you can be forced to do things, to perform certain actions in with your body, but at the same time, you have freedom to think whatever you want. You can't be actually forced to think anything, and yeah. So this is a notion of freedom as so if we want to consider this world of representation, or this realm of representation, as one in which we're free, we have to think of mental activity as a kind of action that we can undertake on our own responsibility, and not something that is distinct from action. Yeah, so there is this difficulty of this sort of infinite regress of actions, or that we have to insert to make sense of action in the first place.
So just because I haven't brought up Heidegger in like a few months, the notion of I guess Marcus Aurelius' emphasis on death as what gives life meaning, I guess, seemed initially kind of Heideggerian to me, but I think it actually has an opposite. Like death is what gives life meaning because, well, for Marcus Aurelius, it's the total dissolution of the individual, whereas I think for Heidegger, contemplation of death is what gives a kind of consistency to the individual, as opposed to, I guess, the emphasis of the dissolution.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in Heidegger, death is connected with the idea of a totality, or a closeness of the individual, or a completion of the individual. Like there's the discussion of in what sense there can be something like a completion of an individual, is a sort of prelude to the discussion of death in Being and Time. And yeah, there for Marcus Aurelius, as we see here, the death is not the completion of the individual, but the dissolution of the individual. So the individual is reincorporated into the order of the universe, and it's this unity with the universe, or this reincorporation into the universe, that is what makes death something that gives meaning to life, as opposed to, for Heidegger, it's the individualization, the fact that death is in each case mine, that makes death significant for the life of the individual. Okay, so let's go on to the Plotinus section. This is a couple pages long, so I think we can maybe break it up. Let's break it up into a couple sections. We'll see how long it takes us to get through Plotinus, but we might not go any further than that today, and we'll see. Let's break it up into a couple of readings. So I'll read the first page or so. Plotinus. For Plotinus, a being's degree of unity depends on the degree of union of its parts, from the heap of pebbles consisting in a simple juxtaposition up to the organized living body whose parts are maintained by the tension of the soul, by passing through a collective body like a chorus or an army. Union can be conceived as increasing to the point where the parts fuse together and become exceedingly inseparable. In a living body, the parts have solidarity with one another but are locally separate. In a science, a part is a theorem, and each theorem contains all the others in potentia. With a further degree of unification, one passes from the genus of corporeal individuality to spiritual individuality. Yet every reality in which the union of the parts is not perfect supposes a more perfect unity, that of the soul that contains them, whether it be a question of the unity of the parts of a living body or the unity of the parts of the world. Nothing is a coherent and consistent individual except through the one. Despite Aristotle's opinion, being and the one are not convertible. The one is the principle of being. All that is real in the living being comes from the one, which governs it. In this sense, everything real in the body is contained in the form of seminal reasons within the soul of the living being. All reality is comprehended when it is related to a more perfect mode of intelligibility discovered in a superior unity. This unity is not due to the activity proper to an agent that penetrates a matter by way of the total mixture and retains the parts by its tension. For Plotinus, the genus of unity is that of a science. In a science, the mind is one because it contemplates one and the same object. The contemplation of the superior principle is what introduces unity into inferior reality. Like intelligence, nature is the tacit, unconscious contemplation of the intelligible model that it strives to imitate. Thesis becomes a thrust that stems not from the element that produces individuals, but from the contemplation and imitation of the ideal model reflected in the created individual. The superior principle of unity therefore remains in itself, in its unchangeable perfection and immobility. Nothing of itself passes into the inferior reality. It only acts by filling things with its light and its reflection to the extent that things are capable of receiving them. The cosmos is unique, finite and eternal, with its own order, which is always identical to itself. There is a unicity and unity of the world, a sympathetic bond between its parts. The first principle is the one or first, insofar as there is not yet any division. It is nothing because there is nothing distinct in it. And it is everything because it is the power of all things, like the one of the Parmenides. This absolute individual, the one, is therefore that of which the same things can be affirmed and denied. But the one is also the good, like in the seventh book of the Republic. It is, quote, beyond essence, unquote. The super-essential nothingness is hypostasis, without being essence or substance. Individuality is therefore absolutely first. It is the first hypostasis. This first hypostasis can only be characterized by the role that it will play with respect to the subordinate hypostasis. But this absolute individual could remain the unique because conserving all reality contracted in it. It does not remain the unique because everything perfect produces its similar, like the living being reaching adulthood. This production is unconscious and involuntary. It is due to a kind of superabundance, like that of a river source whose overflow spills out, or like that of a light in diffusion. The being is consequently endowed with a sort of expansion that characterizes full individuality. The individual reality of the living being, of the river source of light, loses nothing by expanding, and they retain all their reality within themselves. Procession is the forward march of the individual reality of the being, a forward march that originates with the principle. On the contrary, conversion is the fact of an imperfect individuality. The being that proceeds turns back towards its producer to contemplate it. The second hypostasis is being, intelligence, and intelligible world. We'll stop here. Right. So Plotinus is considered a Neoplatonist. So he's writing in, I think, the 3rd century A.D. So and it's something that I think we maybe tend to forget is that Plato is already like 600, 700 years old at the time Plotinus is writing. So this is like sort of a revival of something that's already quite old at the time that Plotinus is writing. It's not just a sort of continuity with Plato, but so Plotinus takes up certain ideas that we find in some of Plato's dialogues on this notion of something beyond essences, epictetus ousias, this notion of the one or the good as something that is beyond essence, beyond the realm of the ideas, and is what gives reality to the ideas. The ideas have reality as a sort of reflection of the one, and so the one here is the source of everything that exists, but it can't itself be said to exist because it has no distinction or separation within it. It's uh, uh, it's only in light of the one that other things can be said to exist. And then there's this doctrine of procession. So there's this I don't know, I don't remember all the details of the doctrine, but there's a procession from the one to I think mind or soul or something along those lines. There's like a series of different principles that proceed from the one and descend to the realm of the cosmos, the order of the world, and ultimately descend to matter, which is the lowest level of the procession. So each level descends from the one above it, and this procession or this emanation is another term that's sometimes used. Is a kind of it's not a creation. It's not something that happens in time, but it's a kind of uh, metaphysical event, I guess we can say. It's something that happens. It's not a creation, also in the sense that it's not something that the one is not a person that chooses to create the world. It's the one sort of overflows itself into the next principle, which again overflows itself into the principle below it, and so on, all the way down to matter, which is next to nothingness. Okay, let's go on to the next page of the Plotinus section. If you'd like to read, Angus.
Yes. I guess I'll just read through the end here. Like 2 pages. Or
Yeah.
should I just, okay. Or should I just do one page?
Yeah, let's do one page. This is fairly dense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One becomes distended and multiplied therein being the second hypostasis. Reality is discharged therein in a hierarchized multiplicity of genera and species, which happens to form through a sort of dialectic. The individual exists in the intelligible world. There are ideas of individuals. On this point, the doctrine is quite different from that of Aristotle, for whom the individual, realized in the sensible world, contained all the characteristics of specific form augmented by an indefinite number of other characteristics due to 1,000 accidents encountered by the specific form of man in its realization. According to Plotinus, in its realization in the sensible individual, form does not receive a new positive characteristic. The intelligible world contains all possible richness. The second hypostasis is both intelligence and the intelligible. The distinction between intelligence and the intelligible corresponds to a degree of relaxation of the first absolute and first individuality of the first hypostasis, an individuality which is also an indivision. The reciprocity of intelligence, right? Reciprocity of intelligence in the intelligible is the maintenance in two associated terms of a functional and somewhat operative indivision that is equivalent with the absolute unity of the first hypostasis without, however, being as perfect as it. The hypostasized intelligence must discover in itself all the richness of the intelligible world. The thought of oneself gives it the certainty of its content. Its knowledge is prepared as it begins. Intelligence is a vision of oneself and of the intelligible world. The intelligible world has the structure of a society of intelligences in which each intelligence thinks all the others by thinking itself. Reflection, return to oneself, is therefore at once unity and plurality, returning to unity. Individual souls appear at the level of the third hypostasis. Their destiny is part of an overarching plan. The world is a theater in which providence assigns each its role. The soul acts by way of contemplation. It organizes because it contemplates by way of an influence that emanates from it without its will, as if the figures of which a geometer thinks were sketched out by themselves. The individual world and the sensible world are linked to their own essence, from which they cannot escape. On the contrary, the first principle is endowed with an absolute freedom. It is not bound to any essence. The contrary of individuality is matter, of which it is impossible to say self, a completely undetermined and even indeterminable thing, something impassive and incomparable to absolute poverty in the myth told in the Symposium. Individuality is far from being the union of a form and a matter, since form does not make matter more determined. There is no veritable union of form and matter. The sensible is a simple, fleeting reflection of form and matter, and it no more affects matter than light affects the air it suffuses. This matter is the last reflection of the one before the complete darkness of nothingness. When I first read this section on the second hypostasis, I didn't get that intelligence and the intelligible were not sort of like particular individual human intelligences and the intelligible world, but a sort of broader like intelligence itself, which seems to encompass all the individual souls that are brought about by, I guess, the procession into the third hypostasis. Does that sound right?
Yeah, again, my knowledge of Plotinus is not very detailed, but yeah, so intelligence here is a kind of principle of intelligence, and not the intelligence of a particular person or of individual people. Um, and we can also like again we can compare this to the Aristotelian doctrine about thought thinking itself, and the agent intellect. There's this very obscure passage in De Anima about how the agent intellect is separate from the passive intellect, or is something distinct from the passive intellect, and it seems to be this kind of principle of intelligence in the universe. And commentators have identified that with the discussion of God in Metaphysics Lambda, uh, and so Plotinus follows in the same sort of vein, that he thinks of intelligence as a thought thinking itself, and it's the immediate procession from the one. The one is this sort of immediate unity with itself. It doesn't have this um, reflexive structure, but thought has, or the intelligence has this reflexive structure, this sort of self reference to it, that descends from the immediate unity of the one. And yeah, so the as Simondon puts it here, there's the intelligence and the realm of the intelligible are sort of identical to each other, but there's a kind of intelligence has to sort of discover this identity with the intelligible world. So it has to sort of actively go through the thought of itself in order to return to itself and become what it really is. It has to it can only think the intelligible by thinking itself, or it thinks itself through thinking what is intelligible. There's a sort of immediate unity of those two things. And also we have here, within the realm of the intelligible, we have uh, ideas of individuals, which, as Simondon points out, is something that doesn't appear in Aristotle. So in Aristotle, we have the form of an individual, or the form that an individual has is a kind of species form. So there's a form of horseness or a form of humanity, um, uh, and then the individual is has various properties that don't belong to that form or that idea of the species. So a horse is brown or white or whatever, and horseness as such doesn't contain a particular color. Um, but in Plotinus, we instead have these ideas of individuals, and so form is fully determinate in the sense that the idea of this particular horse includes the fact that the horse is brown, that it weighs so many kilograms, that it has this exact number of hairs on its body, and so on. Everything is included in the idea of that horse. So yeah, so the realm of the intelligible is kind of self-contained. It doesn't have this sort of interaction with matter in the way that we find with Aristotle. there's no sense in which the intelligible is sort of filled in by the sensible. The sensible is or the material is kind of a poor reflection of the intelligible worlds, but not something that uh, fills in the forms like we have in Aristotle.
I think the idea that the one is beyond essence is interesting in light of like if essence is like eidos, which I guess is Greek word for aspect, at least as I understand it, then it seems like at least for Aristotle, it's has to do with intelligibility. So if the one doesn't have any aspect or anything by which we can look at it, then it makes sense that there's really nothing that we can say about it.
Yeah, the word for essence here is actually ousia. So the phrase from Plato that this doctrine, the phrase from the Republic is epictetus ousias. So the one or the good is above the essences or above the ousiai. Um,
Oh, interesting.
uh, yeah, and so ousia doesn't have this relation to visibility in the same way as eidos does. Um, but it's drawn from the etymology of ousia is it's drawn from the word for being. But um, the sort of colloquial meaning of ousia in Greek in Plato's time was, or Plato and Aristotle was property. Like ousia is the property that someone has, a farm or a house or whatever. Um, uh, and this and then Plato uses it as a sort of semi-technical term, and then Aristotle specifically uses it as a technical term for essence. But yeah, so in Plotinus, there is a sense in which the one is beyond. So the one is beyond essences, or beyond the realm of essence, because essences are sort of delimited from each other. So entities have certain properties, and then they have other entities have different properties. So a horse has four legs and certain structure and certain properties that come from being a horse, whereas I don't know, a chicken has other properties that are different from those of a horse. So the two essences are sort of distinct from each other. They're delimited from each other, whereas the one is not distinct from anything or is not separated from anything. It doesn't have this distinction within it, delimitation or anything distinct that allows it to be separated from something else. And so it's because of this unseparatedness or indistinction of everything with the one that the one is beyond the realm of essences.
Thanks. That's really interesting. Is it kind of like is the idea that there isn't anything that we can say that the one doesn't have, sort of like these medieval notions of God having to have every attribute because otherwise God wouldn't be perfect?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of influence of the Neoplatonism on Christian philosophy, and I think we can probably one element we can compare with, and I think this comes up in a later reading in this text, is negative theology, which sort of holds that we can only grasp God through negation of attributes. So we can say that God is not corporeal or not finite or whatever, but we can't actually grasp like the positive attributes that God has. And I think Plotinus, his account of the one is a kind of negative theological account of the one, except that there's also, as we'll see in the next section or the next bit of the reading, there's this kind of immediate knowledge of, or not even knowledge, but this immediate union with the one that you can achieve in these rare moments. So Porphyry, who writes the biography of Plotinus, says that Plotinus achieved this unity with the one 4 times in his life. It's this sort of rare event that the sage is capable of not even achieving, because it's not something the sage does, but capable of experiencing, I guess. So there's this unity with the one that's beyond knowledge, and then at the level of knowledge, we can only sort of say what the one is not. We can't actually um, attribute any properties to the one. Okay, I'll read the last bit on Plotinus, and I think that will be our last reading for today. Absolute individuality should not be sought in the corrupted, fleeting, undetermined sensible. All singular souls derive from a unique soul in the same way that intelligence is derived from intelligence. The world soul has prepared a home for each singular soul corresponding to its nature, a home that each soul must look after for the time determined by the order of things. In a sense, the singular soul looks after the body, but it only looks after the body because it contemplates the intelligible order. Converted towards this world and thereby being intelligence, the soul remains close to the intelligence. It is a self-reflection that will illuminate and vivify the body. Yet the soul can turn back toward its reflection. This conversion that is an aversion enslaves the soul to the changes of the sensible world. The soul is consequently like Narcissus, attracted by its image, drowning itself so as to embrace its own image. This descent of the soul determines its life in the sensible world. The goal of philosophical effort is to accomplish the inverse movement. But then the soul and the self must be distinguished. The soul as intelligence contemplating intelligence remains eternally converted toward the intelligible world. Only the self descends toward the reflection that the soul projects instead of remaining at the level of the intelligence. The self is like an intermediary soul between the soul and its reflection. While the superior part of the soul remains on high, the self can sometimes go toward the height, sometimes toward the bottom, toward the soul, or toward the reflection. Destiny is the change that occurs in the soul when it passes from one level to another, successively absorbing all metaphysical landscapes. At the bottom is the life of pleasure, or the active life provided by the social virtues, whereas the life of pleasure is always passive. Higher up is the reflection of the judging and reasoning self, the intermediary level where the soul is master of itself. Higher still is intuitive or intellectual thought, which is at the level of the essences that suppose nothing before them and are intuitive givens. The soul can go no higher, for the one, insofar as it is undetermined, cannot be known, only grasped in an ineffable context, wherein the duality of subject and object is suppressed, that which is at once knowledge and enjoyment of this state. This is ecstasy, which is superior to intelligence and to thought, state in which Plotinus raved 4 times according to Porphyry. The being who experiences ecstasy loses all notion of himself. Maybe first I'll just give a bit of a translation point here. So the last line where it says in the translation, a state in which Plotinus raved 4 times, that's not really a good translation. I think I'm not sure exactly what would be a good translation, but a state in which Plotinus was in ecstasy or something like that is better. Or a state in which Plotinus was transported, maybe would work. But the idea is that this state of unity with the one is something that happens to the sage or the philosopher who practices contemplation of the one, this kind of meditation practice, and then this experience of ecstasy of union with the one is something that happens rarely to the philosopher, and this is the highest that the highest state that we can experience, and other states are subordinated to this state. So the highest that the soul can achieve for its own part or on its own is this contemplation of ideas. So the soul can contemplate ideas through its own capacity or its own virtue, but it can only have this union with the one through this chance experience, not quite chance, but through this rare experience of ecstasy. So it's not something that the soul brings about in its own right or through its own action. So, are there any questions or comments before we wrap up for today on Plotinus?
No, other than that, this section was very dense.
Yeah, Plotinus is a difficult writer. He and my knowledge of Greek is pretty limited, but from what I've heard and a little that I've seen myself, his Greek is also kind of weird as well. Uh, at least in comparison, like the sort of standard Attic Greek that you learn by reading like Plato or Herodotus or someone like Thucydides or whatever. This in comparison with that, Plotinus's Greek is different. Like he's writing 600 or 700 years later. He's from Egypt and not from Athens. Um, and so he's hard to read, even for like specialists in ancient Greek. Um, and he writes very abstractly. So he talks about the one and the procession from the one and these principles, intelligence, and the world soul, and so on. He doesn't talk about like sort of concrete ethical principles in the way that you might find in Marcus Aurelius or someone easier to read.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be picking up the Enneads anytime soon.
Yeah, there's also the issue of translation because like it's a collection of 6 books if I remember correctly, and there are a few different partial translations that are available, but there's also I think the only modern there are 2 modern complete translations, but one is in the Loeb Classical Library, so it's like a scholarly uh, publication, and then there's one that's more recent from like 2010 or something that is also for scholars. And like I looked to see if I would want to buy it, and it's like $150 for the volume or something like that. So yeah, the text is inaccessible for practical reasons as well. It's hard to get a hold of a complete translation.
How much for the Plotinus Revival 2022?
Yeah, we can raise money to buy a copy of the Enneads
Yeah.
and start a Plotinus group.
Server-wide copy. Yeah.
Okay, so let's end here for today, and then next time we will look at this. Well, we'll start on the late Hellenistic era and some of the Neoplatonists and their connection with some religious and magical doctrines, and then we'll get into Christianity. And Simondon has some interesting discussion of some of the different schools of Christianity and the different churches that were sort of in conflict in the late Roman era.
That's cool. That sounds exciting. The subject of the next session.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming out, and hope to see you next week.
Thanks, Don. See you next week.